"That must be your husband," the attending nurse said, glancing at her clipboard, then at the man sitting rigid in the chair beside the hospital bed. "6 hours and he hasn't moved once. You don't see that kind of thing very often." Nathan Briggs went completely still. He was not her husband. He was an electrician from East Vancouver who had pulled a stranger from a stalled elevator shaft the previous evening, 20 minutes before the hotel's east wing burned. He had learned her last name only when the paramedics asked, and she had given it, quietly, precisely, even half-conscious and bleeding through her left eyebrow. He opened his mouth. He had the correction ready. One sentence. Polite, factual, finished. Cassandra Volk looked at him from the bed, not confused, not disoriented, fully, deliberately present. She reached across the sheet and closed her hand around his wrist with a grip that had no business being that firm. "He is," she said, her voice level, "and I'm not letting go of him either." The nurse smiled. She noted something in the chart. She left. Nathan waited until the door settled shut. That wasn't true. "No," Cassandra said. She was looking at the ceiling. There was a laceration along her jaw and the beginning of a bruise above her left brow, and something very precise was happening behind her eyes. It wasn't. You needed a reason for a stranger to be sitting here. A husband has a reason. A witness files a statement. I need 24 hours before anyone files anything. She turned to look at him. "Someone put me in that elevator deliberately, and whoever did it knows which hospital I was brought to." Nathan sat back in the chair. He had a daughter at home, 9 years old, being watched by his mother until morning. He had a job site in Burnaby starting at 7. He had been sitting in this room for 6 hours because the emergency desk had said the patient's emergency contact wasn't answering, and he had thought it would be wrong to simply leave. He was reconsidering the wisdom of that in real time. "What was in the briefcase?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "You have it." He did. He had grabbed it in the same motion as everything else when he'd gotten her out, instinct running ahead of thought, and it had been sitting at his feet in this room for 6 hours. He had not opened it. "The drive inside," she said. "Small. Blue. It contains the unmodified dataset for a clinical trial Meridian submitted to Health Canada last spring." She paused. "The version Meridian submitted is not the same as the version on that drive." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Meridian Pharmaceutical," he said. "Yes." "Your company." "My company," she said without flinching. "My name on the door and my cousin's hands on the data." Her name on the door. He knew the name. He had known it for 3 years, not from the news, not from the business pages. He knew it from a coroner's report and a stack of WorkSafe BC filings and 400 hours of his own research in the back room of his house after his daughter was in bed. He didn't say that yet. Cassandra Volk had not slept more than 4 hours in a row for 2 weeks. She sat in the back of the company car on the way to the gala and stared at the same page of the Veritrix efficacy summary she had been staring at for days. The numbers were wrong. Not catastrophically, not in a way that would have tripped an automated flag at Health Canada, but wrong in the specific quiet way that told her someone had sanded down the rough edges and replaced them with something that looked clean, only if you didn't know what clean actually looked like. She knew. She had a degree in biochemistry before she went to law school, and she had spent 12 years understanding exactly how pharmaceutical data was supposed to look. She had taken over as CEO of Meridian Group 4 years ago, after her father's death, not the way she'd imagined inheriting the company, not at 38, not alone, but she'd done it. Her cousin Royce had been there through all of it, older by 7 years. Smooth in the way of someone who had always assumed every room would accommodate him. He ran Meridian's clinical development division, had for years. When her father was alive, Royce had been charming and strategically attentive in equal measure. Since Cassandra had the top chair, he had become something that required more careful language to describe. For 5 months, he had been pushing Veritrix toward final regulatory approval, with a force that she had come to understand was not about the drug. He had buyers arranged, partnership letters drafted. All he needed was her signature on the trial submission. And he spoke about her reluctance to give it the way a contractor speaks about a permit that is simply taking too long. She had told him 3 times she was not signing off on a dataset she could not verify. He had told her 3 times she was being unnecessarily cautious. The night before the gala, a message had arrived in her internal company inbox from an address she didn't recognize. 5 words: "Don't sign Veritrix, you're watched." She had stared at it for a long time. Then she had deleted it, assuming it was a pressure tactic from someone in Royce's orbit. She was wrong about that, but she would not learn how wrong until later. Nathan Briggs could read an electrical system the way some people read faces. It wasn't a skill he had ever tried to explain. It lived somewhere between instinct and 18 years of doing the work, the particular flicker in a panel that meant a neutral wire going bad. The way a breaker that kept tripping was telling you something about the load upstream that nobody had listened to yet. He had been called to the Fairmont on Burrard that evening for an emergency repair, a short in the main distribution panel in the East Service Wing. Hotel management needed it done before the gala wound down and the kitchen load peaked. He had been in the sub-basement with his tools for 40 minutes when the power in the east elevator shaft went irregular. Not a full outage, a fluctuation, the kind that told him the backup routing in that section was being asked to carry something it hadn't been sized for. He was already moving toward the shaft access when he heard the alarm. The elevator was stopped between the 4th and 5th floors. He found the manual release, got the door open, and climbed. The car was sitting at an awkward angle. Not a full failure, something mechanical jammed in the track, which he would understand later was not mechanical at all but deliberate. A simple modification to the track brake that anyone with the right access could have made in under 3 minutes. There was a woman inside. She was conscious, sitting upright against the back wall, her briefcase in her lap, her expression one of controlled fury rather than panic. The smoke from the east wing was beginning to reach the shaft. She stood before he asked her to. She was already thinking about what came next. He got her out. He grabbed the briefcase because she was using both hands to get through the access hatch, and it would have been left behind otherwise. They made it to the service stairwell and down to the lobby, just as the fire suppression system triggered on the 4th floor. In the lobby, she had looked at him, not with relief, not quite, with the particular attention of someone filing information for later use. Then she said, "Don't let anyone see that briefcase." Then she had passed out. If you're coming to this story without knowing what Meridian Pharmaceutical Group is, here is what you need to understand. It is one of the largest mid-size pharmaceutical companies in Canada, publicly traded, headquartered in Vancouver, with a clinical development division that had been operating with extraordinary independence for nearly a decade, and that independence had been Royce Volk's design from the beginning. Nathan asked Cassandra about the drive in the early hours of the morning. She explained it plainly. The original Veritrix efficacy data, the version on the drive, showed a side effect profile in the cardiac cohort that was troubling. Not disqualifying, but it required additional long-term monitoring and a revised label. The version Royce had submitted to Health Canada showed a cardiac cohort that was statistically clean. The kind of dataset that sailed through review without friction. Someone had gone into the raw database and smoothed the numbers. Royce controls the clinical database access, she said. He has controlled it for years. I gave him that authority before I understood what he was going to do with it. Nathan looked at the briefcase on the floor. Then he said, "I need to tell you something." He told her about Sandra. Not all of it, the parts that mattered. His wife Sandra had worked as a quality control technician at a pharmaceutical packaging facility in Port Coquitlam. 3 years ago, a gas line failure in the facility's HVAC system had caused an explosion in the East Storage Unit. Sandra had been in that unit. She had died alongside a maintenance worker named Phil Kowalczyk, who had a wife and 3 kids in Coquitlam. The WorkSafe BC report had cited equipment malfunction, inadequate maintenance of the gas coupling, operator error. Nathan had read that report 40 times. He had never believed a word of it. In the months after Sandra died, while his mother looked after his daughter and he tried to hold the shape of himself together, he had begun reconstructing the facility's electrical and safety system schematics from publicly available permits and inspection filings. He had been an electrician for 18 years. He knew what those systems were supposed to look like. He knew what the inspection record should have shown if anyone had actually checked the coupling in question. The record showed inspections he was increasingly certain had never taken place. The facility in Port Coquitlam had been operated by a contract manufacturer, whose primary client at the time of the explosion had been a subsidiary of Meridian Pharmaceutical Group. He had known this for 2 years. He had done nothing with it because he did not have enough, and because every lawyer he had consulted told him that correlation was not causation, and that he would need documentation showing what the actual inspection records said versus what had been filed. Cassandra did not speak for a long time after he finished. The facility was managed by a company called Harrock Contract Manufacturing, she said at last. Royce brought them in. He managed that relationship personally. I had no visibility into the operational compliance side. I know, Nathan said. I know that doesn't, she stopped. I know that doesn't give Sandra back. No, he said, it doesn't. The silence that followed was not a comfortable one. It was not meant to be. Nathan sat with what he now knew, that the company whose name was on this conversation was the same company that had likely been responsible for the explosion that killed his wife. He sat with that and did not try to resolve it because it was not the kind of thing that resolved in a hospital room at 4 in the morning. A message came through on Cassandra's personal phone the following noon. It was from an address she cross-referenced against her contacts and found belonged to Clement Varga, Meridian's senior compliance officer. A quiet, methodical man in his early 60s, who had been with the company longer than Cassandra had been alive. Clement said he had a file, offline encrypted, compiled over 3 years, internal incident reports that had been deleted from Meridian's active database, safety complaints rerouted to dead inboxes, WorkSafe BC correspondence that had been handled by Royce's office rather than the compliance department as protocol required. 8 years of documentation. He had not come forward earlier because he knew Royce would have him removed before the file reached anyone with authority to act on it. He needed someone to receive it. He asked to meet them at Meridian's Yaletown office, sublevel, after hours. They went. There was no clean way to enter the building as themselves, so they entered as what they had become. Cassandra had explained it practically, the way she explained everything. Royce would have someone watching the building for anything that looked like a threat. Nobody looked twice at a woman returning to her own office after hours with her husband. Nathan did not say anything to that. He put on the jacket Cassandra had her assistant send over, his size, which she had noted without comment, and they walked in through the main lobby with her hand in the crook of his arm. She moved through the building the way she had moved through it for 4 years, unhurried, like she owned it, which she did in a manner of speaking. He moved the way he always moved, directly and without performance. When they passed the camera bank in the second lobby, she stepped slightly closer to him. He registered the shift in her weight. He noticed that the hand resting against his sleeve was absolutely steady. He noticed that she was breathing through her nose in the measured way of someone who did not intend to show anything. They were 40 feet from the sub-level access when the building's main lighting cut out. Not a power failure. The emergency lighting on the stairwell walls activated within 4 seconds, which meant the system was functioning. The main lights had been killed deliberately. Nathan knew the difference. He had been making that distinction for 18 years. He pulled Cassandra sideways behind a support column before he finished thinking about it. He heard footsteps. 2 sets moving fast from the direction of the parking level. He dealt with what came around the column. Not cleanly, not without cost to his shoulder, but conclusively, and got hold of a phone that had been dropped in the process. He looked at the screen. The message read, "Recover the drive, find the daughter if needed. Treat him accordingly." Nathan read it twice. He was not her husband. He had been in the role for 17 hours, but whoever was sending these instructions believed he was the person Cassandra trusted most in the world, which meant they believed he was the most direct obstacle between Royce and what Royce still needed from her. The role he had agreed to hold for 24 hours had just become the reason someone had sent 2 men into this building. Clement had seen the blackout from the stairwell and pulled back. He sent a text 4 minutes later. "Files are secure. I'll find another route." Nathan and Cassandra waited in a utilities room off the north stairwell until it was clear. She sat down on the floor. The professional composure she had maintained since the hospital settled out of her expression like sediment clearing from water. She was not performing anything. She was simply a person sitting on a concrete floor in the dark, very tired. She said that when her father died, Royce had been the one constant. She had believed it was family. She understood now that it had been positioning. He had always been waiting for the moment when the company needed a single point of authority, and he had arranged himself to be indispensable to the person who held it. Discovering that he had tried to kill her didn't only feel like betrayal. It felt like losing her father a second time. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he told her about the Tuesday Sandra had called him at noon to say the extraction fan in the storage unit smelled wrong. He had told her he'd look at the specs that evening. He'd had a job run long. He hadn't looked. 3 weeks later, the coupling failed. He had spent 3 years deciding that was on him. Cassandra turned to look at him in the dark. She did not rush it. After a long moment, she said, "The coupling failed because someone had been filing false inspection reports for 2 years to save Royce's contractor money. The person responsible for Sandra's death is the person who chose to do that, not the man who got held up on a job site and figured he'd deal with something the next evening." She said it carefully. "The way you correct a calculation error rather than offer comfort. She knew you were coming home that night. That's not the same thing as not coming back." It was not a grand statement. It didn't fix anything. But something in the flatness of how she said it, no softness padded around the edges, no performance, reached the part of Nathan that had never been able to hear it before. He breathed out slowly. They sat in the dark for a while after that. Royce called an emergency board meeting for the following morning. He framed it as a welfare concern. The accident, Cassandra's condition, the sudden appearance of an unknown man who had apparently been presenting himself as her husband. He moved to have her signing authority temporarily suspended pending review. If the board voted with him, Veritrix went to final approval under interim authority, which meant Royce. Nathan told her he didn't think she should go in. The building was compromised. Walking into a boardroom full of people Royce had been cultivating for years was not a controlled environment. Cassandra asked if he wanted to leave because the arrangement was finished, or because he was afraid of what was forming between them. He didn't answer. His phone rang. His daughter's voice was the most ordinary sound he had heard in 2 days. She was not calling about anything urgent. She said, "Dad, are you coming home for dinner?" "Grandma made shepherd's pie." That was it. That was the whole question. And something opened in Nathan's chest that he hadn't known was sealed, because Poppy had asked him some version of that question every single evening since Sandra died. Not because she cared about the menu, because she needed to know he was going to come back. He told her he'd be late. He told her to eat without him. He told her he loved her, and she said she knew, and that was that. He called his mother, Barbara. He gave her an address in Burnaby, a property with a locked gate and old trees along the fence line belonging to a union friend. He told her to take Poppy there and not mention it to anyone. Barbara asked one question. "Are you all right?" He said yes. She said okay. He went back to find Cassandra. She was standing at the window with her coat on and her bag over her shoulder. Before he could speak, she said, "I won't let Poppy lose another parent." Nathan looked at her for a moment. "Then don't make her watch me lose you." He reached for his jacket from the hook by the door. As he pushed his arm through the sleeve, his hand caught something in the inside pocket. A folded piece of paper, small, creased with the precision of a 9-year-old who took folding seriously. He stopped. He pulled it out. It was a drawing in pencil and orange crayon. 3 figures standing in front of a house with a garden sketched along the bottom edge. The figure on the left was tall and wore a jacket. The figure on the right had long hair drawn in careful waves. The figure in the middle was small. All 3 were holding hands. Nathan stood in the hallway and looked at the drawing for a long moment. He did not ask himself when Poppy had put it there. He did not ask who the 3 figures were. He folded it back along its original creases and put it in his shirt pocket, closer in. "Let's go," he said. The Meridian boardroom held 14 people, most of whom Royce had been managing in some form or another for years. Nathan set the drive on the table and explained what it was. He used precise language. He did not raise his voice. He explained the difference between the data Meridian had submitted to Health Canada and the data that existed in the original trial record. And he explained what that difference indicated about the cardiac cohort outcomes that had been erased from the submission. Then he opened his own encrypted archive on the room's display, the file he had been building for 3 years, permit by permit, inspection record by inspection record, and pulled up the WorkSafe BC compliance filings for the Port Coquitlam facility beside the internal Meridian correspondence Clement had forwarded that morning. The inspection sign-offs that coincided with dates Clement's records showed no inspector had visited the site. The messages routed through Royce's office, rather than the compliance department as protocol required. Clement arrived 11 minutes in. He opened a folder and set it on the table, and what it contained was 8 years of documentation. Safety complaints rerouted and never actioned. Regulatory correspondences that had bypassed the compliance department. The Port Coquitlam incident in full, the original internal assessment that had identified the false inspection records, the revised version that replaced it in the active file 3 days after Sandra's death. Royce stood at the head of the table and spoke with the collected authority of a man who had been running a long and complicated operation, and had expected this moment to arrive. He said Cassandra was impaired following her accident. He said the materials were fabricated by a man with a personal and litigious interest in the company. He said the board had a fiduciary responsibility. Building security arrived. They took Nathan's arm and Clement's and moved them toward the elevator. The elevator did not go to the lobby, it went down. Royce had not been managing the board for a decade. He had been managing the building. The lower level of the Meridian Tower had a testing suite for pharmaceutical manufacturing equipment, a sealed room with controlled environmental systems, no windows, and a door that locked from the outside. Royce followed them down, calm as paperwork, and stood in the center of the room and told Cassandra she could sign the interim authority transfer, or he would find what he was already looking for. Nathan heard looking for. Not found, not she's already with us. Present tense active, not yet resolved, which meant Barbara had gotten Poppy out of the house before anyone had started searching. He let that settle, then he steadied. Cassandra asked Royce to explain the whole plan to her. "If you want me to sign," she said, in the voice she used for board presentations, authoritative, like she expected to be answered, "I need to understand exactly what I'm agreeing to." Royce was a man who had been running a quiet operation for a very long time and had finally arrived at the moment when the silence could end. He spoke for 4 minutes and 20 seconds. He named the foreign buyer for Veritrix's underlying delivery platform. He explained the terms. He explained the scope, not just the drug, but the data infrastructure, the trial methodology that could be replicated across multiple compounds in multiple markets. He was thorough. He was proud of it in the way of someone who has kept a secret so long that finally telling it feels like a kind of relief. Nathan, during those 4 minutes and 20 seconds, had worked his phone from his jacket pocket by small increments, opened the recording function by feel, and captured everything. When Royce finished, Nathan pushed the audio file and the drive's extracted data to the encrypted account number Clement had given him the previous day. His phone vibrated once. Confirmed. Royce noticed the signal anomaly on the room's display panel at the same moment he noticed Nathan's expression. He said one word to the guards. Nathan was already moving, toward the fire suppression panel bolted to the north wall, an industrial lever that required real force and would flood the room with suppressant foam regardless of whether there was an actual fire. He had noticed it when they walked in. He noticed most things. In the white noise and sudden loss of visibility, he crossed to the secondary environmental control panel on the far wall. The door seal on the testing suite was mechanical, not digital, a failsafe, because engineers who built sealed pharmaceutical environments always built a failsafe, and it had a manual release from the inside. He had Cassandra out the door in 30 seconds. The police arrived with the audio file, the clinical data, and 8 years of Clement's documentation already transmitted to the Office of the Federal Health Regulator, and to a journalist at the Globe, who had been filing access to information requests about Meridian's safety record for 14 months, and receiving non-answers in return. They had enough to make the arrest without anything needing to be explained twice. Royce was walked out of the building through the same corridor he had used to walk them down. He said nothing. He had the expression of a man who had considered this contingency and had believed it was unlikely. The formal review took 6 weeks. The Veritrix submission was pulled. Health Canada opened a full audit of Meridian's clinical development division. The Port Coquitlam explosion was reclassified by WorkSafe BC as resulting from documented negligence in the maintenance oversight chain. Negligence that traced, through Harrock Contract Manufacturing and the internal Meridian correspondence, to decisions made in Royce's division. Sandra Briggs and Phil Kowalczyk were listed in the reclassification. The finding was 4 sentences. The explosion had resulted from systemic failures in the inspection and compliance process. Both workers had performed their duties appropriately. Neither had been at fault in any respect. The record had been incorrectly attributed. Nathan received the notification by email on a Wednesday afternoon while Poppy was at school. He read it twice at the kitchen table. Then he folded the paper and put it in the drawer where he kept things he needed to keep. Cassandra gave a statement to the press that did not minimize what the company had done. She did not frame it as Royce's crime alone. She said the structure had allowed it. The compartmentalization, the deference to a division that had been operating without genuine oversight for years. and that restructuring that was her responsibility, not a public relations exercise. She established an independent safety compliance function with an external board and contracted 2 outside organizations to audit every active clinical program. When a reporter asked about the electrician, the man who had pulled her from the elevator and stayed through all of it, she answered without hesitation. She said he wasn't her husband. She said he was a man who had climbed into an elevator shaft because something was wrong, and he was the kind of person who moved toward that rather than away from it. She said he had spent 3 years in a back room building a case for his wife because he believed the official account was wrong. She said he had been right. She said the company owed him something it could not adequately repay, and that she intended to try anyway. Nathan went back to work. He picked Poppy up from school on the Thursday and listened to her explain a project she was doing on the deepwater ecosystem of the Pacific. She talked the whole drive home. He was rotating a wire connector in his hands, standing in his garage when Cassandra's car pulled in. She was alone. She walked across the driveway with the same directness she brought to everything and set a folder on his workbench. Inside were the reclassification documents and a letter in her own handwriting, 2 pages on plain paper. "I'm not here to ask you for anything," she said. Nathan set down the connector. He told her that when he had been standing in that sealed room with the file uploading and 30 seconds to get her out, he had thought very clearly about the possibility of getting it wrong. He had been fully aware of what wrong would mean, and in the middle of holding that thought, he had had another thought, one that had nothing to do with the door, something he hadn't said to her while they were still in the stairwell, and if he got it wrong, he wouldn't get the chance to say it. He said he had stayed through all of it not because of the evidence, and not only because of Sandra, though he had needed that too, more than he could properly explain. He had stayed because somewhere in the past 48 hours he had stopped thinking of Cassandra as someone in his care, and had started thinking of her as someone he did not want to lose. He hadn't felt that way about anything in a long time. He didn't know fully what to do with it, but he was not going to behave as though it wasn't there. He said it the way he said everything, plain, without decoration, straight off the surface of what was true. Cassandra was quiet for a moment. "Are you afraid?" "Yes." "Do you want to try anyway?" He looked at her. "That's why I'm still standing here." 3 months later, Cassandra established an independent pharmaceutical safety center in Vancouver, separate from Meridian, with an external board and a full veto over any compound that failed to meet its standards. She asked Nathan to hold that veto. He accepted on one condition: the center would carry the names of Sandra Briggs and Phil Kowalczyk on the building, not in a footnote, on the building. She agreed without negotiating. Poppy took her time. She was not a child who could be managed or hurried along, she observed. She assessed. She reached her own conclusions at her own pace, and she did not share them until she was ready. She watched Cassandra for weeks before she brought the photograph from the mantel, a shot of Nathan and Sandra from the summer before Poppy was born, both of them squinting into the sun at Jericho Beach, and held it out. "Was she nice?" Poppy asked. Cassandra looked at the photograph for a long moment. "From everything I can tell, very," she said. "And your dad thinks about her every day. You can see it in him when he does." Poppy looked at the photograph. Then she set it back in its place and went to get her shoes because they were supposed to be going for bubble tea, and she had already decided what flavor she wanted. She did not ask any more questions about it. But after that afternoon, she stopped sitting still when Cassandra came over. The follow-up appointment was 5 weeks after discharge. The same nurse, Trish, was on shift, and she recognized them both before they reached the desk. "Well," she said, with the warmth of someone who felt she had been present at the start of something good. "What do I call him today? The man who carried you out of a burning building, or the world's most patient husband?" Nathan started to speak. Cassandra looked at him, a direct, clear look, the kind she reserved for things she meant exactly. "Not my husband yet," she said, "but he's the man I'm in love with and the only person I want to build something with." Nathan did not speak for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and took out a key, brass, worn at the edges, cut for the front door of the house he had been slowly renovating for 2 years, the one with the extra room he had framed and drywalled and then stopped because he hadn't known what it was for. He set it on the desk in front of her. "No arrangement," he said, "no conditions, just a door and a room that's been waiting." Cassandra picked up the key. She turned it once in her palm. Then she took his hand, firmly, deliberately, with full intention. And this time, there were no cameras to consider, no role to maintain, no one watching for whom the gesture needed to mean anything. There was just the two of them in a hospital corridor on an ordinary afternoon in Vancouver, holding on. The assumption that had started everything, that must be your husband, had turned out to be the only true thing said in that room. It had simply arrived a little ahead of schedule. Nathan didn't pull Cassandra out of that elevator because of who she was. He pulled her out because something was wrong and he was close enough to do something about it. That's the kind of person he was. And sometimes that's exactly enough. If this story found you at the right moment, consider subscribing to Echoes of Memory. These are the stories we tell here. Ordinary people in impossible situations, choosing the harder and better thing. We'll see you next time.